Go. All right, good morning everyone. Good to see a few faces in the audience here. I wasn't quite sure how a separate room would work out, but yeah, it's good to see you all here and come and listen to a presentation from way out west. I'm just going to explain a little bit of context behind this project. When the inception of this project came about, I was actually working on the state government bushfire risk management planning program. And so that's I think there's various equivalents throughout the states, but this was introduced in 2016, just after our state planning policy for bushfire came in. So basically the bushfire risk management planning program put people and resources into local governments that were deemed at high risk of bushfire and had little resources to manage that risk. And this program came out of several inquiries into fires that we had over in the west at the time, the Hills bushfire, the Margaret River fires, and looking at how the various tenure managers coordinated to manage their risk on the ground, because there was kind of a lot of finger pointing about who should have been managing what risk. And it's been great to hear that shared responsibility theme come through this conference and a risk appetite, because that's what we were looking at. Like, how do we break all this down into management components? You know, everyone's managing their own little sections of risk and land independently, but we're next door to each other and we're next door to these communities. So how do we tie all that in together? So in working on the Bushfire Risk Management Planning Program, I worked for 6 different local governments and they were varying kind of risk. A couple of communities were sort of rural communities, a lot of farming properties, so they were quite keen to see a lot of clearing, a lot of work done. They were happy with whatever, you know, you kind of proposed to them. Really, as far as the farmers were concerned, the more clearing, the better. Then it came to working in these communities. So for those of you who are not familiar with Western Australia, the Great Southern is in that bottom part. So you've got sort of Margaret River wine region, south of Perth, everyone's familiar with that. And then you come round the corner a bit and you've got that Great Southern area. So we're right on the bottom coast. It's a high tourist area. Our population's about 60,000. Most of them are based in Albany, the city of Albany. We get about 680,000 tourists annually. So we get that high volume of people who, you know, a lot of overseas tourists, a lot of local tourists come through and they're not familiar with the area. There's a lot of tourism infrastructure, holiday homes, you know, Airbnbs, things like that. So when I was tasked with developing bushfire risk management plans and mitigation plans for these communities, I sort of looked at, you know, what are we basing this on? You know, like, what are we basing our mitigation plans on? And then how are we interpreting that to the local governments? And how are we strategically directing our funds and our efforts into interpreting and managing that risk in these communities? And really at the time, I did a lot of stakeholder consultation, like talking to the local governments and brigades, Parks and Wildlife, DFES, so Department of Fire and Emergency Services. And what was coming back was, well, we've always put this break in here, or we've always kind of, you know, like this vegetation type, we plan burn it. But there wasn't a lot of science directing that rural-urban interface management. And these communities, Denmark in particular, there's a high number of retired academics down that way and environmental activists. So they really want to know, like, why you're clearing that particular piece of vegetation. What's the reasoning and what's the effectiveness? So I applied to the National Disaster Resilience Fund to get some money to do some bushfire attack level contour mapping across these communities, and then to do some broader landscape fire run mapping. So that's when Ecological Australia came into it. We engaged Biodiverse Solutions, which I have jumped ship and moved over to the dark side and working for them now to do the town site mapping. So the locations that we chose, well, they were basically chosen by the local government. So once we had the funding approved, the local governments put forward the areas that they wanted some more, science around data. So in Plantagenet, which is up the top there, we had 2 areas. So Kendanut is a rural subdivision, typical legacy, developed in the 1930s. Lots of small rural blocks, 1 road in and out, surrounded by vegetation. High transient population there. There's different sort of industries that attract a lot of people kind of moving in and out there. Mount Barker Hill is a kind of tree change area. Again, steep slopes surrounded by vegetation, a lot of dead-end roads in that precinct. Then in Denmark, we had 3 precincts. So we had Peaceful Bay, 1 road in and out. This area was impacted by a fire, I think it was around 2016, 17, where everyone in that town was kind of trapped there. Their access was cut off. Everyone went to, had this idea that they'd shelter on the beach. When they went to shelter on the beach, it was really high tide, so they had nowhere to go. They were actually stuck in a car park surrounded by bush. And then there's Ocean Beach and Weedon Hill. So this is Ocean Beach up here. In the middle of that Ocean Beach precinct is an area called Mount Halliwell. It's an A-class reserve. You're looking at 20, 25 degree slopes, full carry forest. Done fuel load measurements in there and you're up to like 160, 70 tonnes per hectare in there, like it's up to my waist. And no one wants you to touch it. And it's surrounded by houses that are basically 1 road in and out. Similarly with Good Beach in Albany, there was another 3 precincts chosen, similar legacy developments, 1 road in and out. Like, what are we going to do with this? People not wanting you to do a lot of mitigation work in there. So how do we interpret to the community how we're going to manage that land and why we are managing it? So Good Beach is up a peninsula called the Tondirup Peninsula, 25 kilometres from the city of Albany. At the moment, the City of Albany have made the decision to pretty much shut down the Tondirup Peninsula for development. So when we're looking at these locations, we were looking at areas for evacuation, where were you under sort of the least amount of bushfire impact. Over in Western Australia, we don't have any policy around places of last resort or, sheltering. That's a kind of project in development, which we're hoping a lot of this information can feed into, the development of that policy, but watch this space. So with each precinct, we looked at the zoning, and that kind of lent to what was the planned land use. We have a fire control notice in Western Australia, so basically each local government comes up with their own fire control notice. It speaks to Section 33 under the Bushfires Act, and depending on the size of your property, where it's zoned, is how you're going to have to manage that property. Do you have to have a boundary fire break, an asset protection zone, like some of the fire control notices have driveway access, water supplies. There's a whole raft of different conditions. So the zoning is quite important. And we wanted to look at where we had public land that potentially could be used as refuge. So then we, Biodiverse Solutions at the time, and I was fortunate enough to be able to go out with the consultants at the time and do the on-ground mapping. So we physically mapped all the vegetation in each precinct. It was a pretty lengthy process. So we mapped it all to AS 3959, looked at the slopes and looked at the vegetation on private property and then external to your 100 and 150 metres. Then we looked at access and water. So this was in conjunction with the local governments and DFES and DBCA. What water did we have in each precinct and what access was already planned in there? And so that kind of fed into a works program that was developed later on to look at, where we could put in future access, where water was deficient. As with, I imagine, most places, water supply is pretty fragile when you have an incident. Not everywhere we looked at had a reticulated water supply either. So we used a PACE model for water. We looked at what was the primary option, basically, your hydrants. Then we looked at what was the alternative. Was there an alternative that existed in that community, a contingency? And then if everything went to pack, if all of those were unavailable, was there an emergency alternative? So this helped advise the community and the local governments, kind of painting that picture of where they're at with their risk and what's going to be available to them in the event of a bushfire impacting them. So out of all that information, we'd develop a works program, like what's the perfect world for that area? Where does the fire control notice need to be applied more stringently? Where do we need fire breaks put in? Where do we need access? Where could we potentially do some planned burning? And then so the AS 3959 bushfire attack level standards, this was a little bit of a sticking point with agencies when we were using this to interpret risk, because essentially, as we know, it just talks to a building standard. But what we're finding in the community is we need to, and the local governments, I suppose in Western Australia, we're just coming along this, bushfire planning, I hate using the word journey, but I'm going to have to now. They only came in 2015. So people are just starting to get their heads around what this means. So when we're interpreting risk and when we're interpreting mitigation activities and how that's reducing the risk to properties, radiant heat is something that people really seem to be able to understand. You give them a map, it's got these colours on it, goes from red, red bad, blue good. And actually how much putting in those measures reduces that radiant heat impact. And when we're doing community engagement with this, and then we're explaining it to, more environmentally kind of activist people in the community, they could see where that managing that area of vegetation, what impact that was having up against those buildings. And then it also points to some retrofitting actions that individual landholders can take. So not perfect, and not what it was intended for, but we found that it is a really good tool in the community and to the local government, because it also points to when, no matter what you do, you're not really going to get those properties out of your flame zone kind of Balfour situation. And when the landholders really need to be more conscious of their evacuation options, their personal, like APZ preparations, and, with the local government, how they treat those areas. You might have to evacuate on instead of just looking at your warning levels, and picking kind of a lower level to evacuate them when everyone else would be. So we then put together these bushfire attack level contour maps. We put beforehand, and then we would feed in all the mitigation measures into the model, and then we'd spit out a post mitigation map. Doesn't kind of look like there's too much change, and in some precincts there really wasn't. But in some areas you would see quite a substantial change. And these were really valuable for both the local government from a planning perspective and to the residents, to kind of show them that, it's the shared responsibility. So if they manage their property, what impact that has on the neighbours. And if their whole street manages their land under their control, what impact that is going to have further down the track. It also looked at evacuation routes in and out of those communities and helped the local government understand where to direct their mitigation funding to work on those roadsides, just to peg the vegetation back a bit and make it easier to be coming in and out of those communities. So, getting to this shared responsibility, like I said, it's been really great to listen to everyone talking about feeding into a shared responsibility. I found that if the community, when you're talking about managing risk, people are just paralysed because it seems like too big a problem to manage. Like, I can't control all these various inputs that are putting me at risk, so I'm really not going to do anything. But breaking it down into a, the local emergency management committee do this, and Parks and Wildlife do this, Fire and Emergency Services do this, local government, we're all doing our piece. Your piece is this bit. And people seem to find that easier to understand and promotes more action. We've seen a lot more action in the community. So I'll hand over to Nathan for the rest of it.
Thanks for that, Melanie. So Ecological Australia were involved in the risk assessment process of the project, the component of the project, and really to try to put some science behind that component of the project. And I guess really what it was trying to achieve was to think about, or to develop the bushfire risk context of the 8 precincts, with really the objective being that could then be used to start the dialogue with the community, start the dialogue with the community groups and various government stakeholders. So the process that we took for that was to consider 4 risk elements: landscape risk, locality risk, building risk and evacuation. And so the process was a GIS spatial analysis teamed up with CSIRO Spark wildfire prediction software. And for each of those, for the first 3, we used that process, and the third one was slightly different. So I'll just touch on those quickly. So landscape risk was really about trying to characterise the bushfire catchment. What is it? How big is it? What sort of exposure is that could that result, or could that present to each of those precincts? The locality risk was really about the degree of hazard or the severity of potential, bushfire in relevance to the immediate surrounds of the precinct. And then the building risk was really about, okay, well, if you have a fire come in, what could that exposure look like for each of the assets? The fourth component was a bit more qualitative, I guess, and it was an evacuation and sort of on-site refuge capability sort of assessment. Okay, so we're looking at the availability and suitability of different options for each of the precincts. Okay, so landscape risk. This is for Ocean Beach, and all the subsequent slides we're just talking about Ocean Beach. Obviously, there was 8 different precincts, and they all varied in their characteristics. But we'll just walk through Ocean Beach. So what we've got on the slide here is on the my left-hand side, your left-hand side, I guess, yep, is the burn perimeter, a part of the analysis. And on the right-hand side, we've got some rate of spread, the rate of spread part of the analysis. So the burn perimeter analysis was really trying to understand the size of the fire catchment. Again, this was generated, through Spark and some spatial analysis techniques. So in that one, we've got a regular grid of ignition points within 5 kilometres of each precinct, and the red line there is the precinct. And then we've ignited fires under different weather conditions and given the fuel characteristics and terrain within that landscape, and tried to explore what does that look like. So we ran 3 different directions, which was based on some weather analysis that we did for the 8 precincts. So from a north-northwest, from a southwest and an east-southwest. And I guess if we look at that burn perimeter map there, what that shows is, okay, under that scenario, which is the north-northwest, the areas that are painted in red and painted in yellow have a much larger fire catchment. Now, obviously, that dynamic is going to change depending on what direction you're looking at. Okay, so we ran all those directions and tallied them up. The rate of spread, we did something similar, but obviously for there we weren't looking at the catchment and the totality. We were more looking at the spread potential and the speed, because we know that that influences the risk context as well. Okay. Locality risk. So as I mentioned at the start, this is more about this, the immediate proximity to each of these precincts. So for this part of the analysis, we were running in Spark, CSIRO Spark, intensity models, bushfire intensity models. And on the screen here, we've got the 3 different directions. Now, they all look different because obviously, depending on which way the wind's blowing, the terrain's different. And that obviously is going to have present a different result in terms of those intensities. And so we ran those for all the precincts. They're within, and then we analysed, the upwind intensity. So if we think about, fire coming from the north-northwest on the left-hand side there, what's the upwind intensity towards that direction? And we're analysing that to each of the buildings within the precinct. And then we went through a process of tallying that up and combining that for the entire precinct. And the third component was the building risk assessment. So this relied on the veg mapping and the BAL assessments that BDS did. And we pinpointed every house, which we also used in the previous analysis, as I mentioned. And then we allocated those BALs to each of those houses and allocated a score to them. So if they were in BAL FZ, if they had a BAL FZ exposure, we allocated them a 5, and then all the way through to BAL 12.5 and even through to BAL low. So BAL low, within 300 metres, we allocated 0.5. So there was a scale there that we allocated based on their exposure. And that allowed us to understand, okay, well, of the dwellings that are in, or of the building assets that are in each precinct, what does that look like in combination, in totality? So as you can see there, 84% within Ocean Beach were in BAL FZ. So obviously for that precinct, quite a high degree of bushfire exposure for a large proportion of the buildings, and a very small amount of buildings in low BAL ratings. So that obviously informs the risk context for that precinct and the other precincts. And there was, as Melanie said, there was a degree of variation across all of the precincts. And the last part of the analysis was looking at what are the opportunities for off-site evacuation, what are the potential options for on-site refuge. Melanie mentioned that there was a precinct that had a recent exposure they weren't able to get, they were trapped in there. So we're looking at both those things. We know options are good. Obviously, off-site is the far preferred. And so we're looking for off-site evacuation, we're looking for, well, what is the population? What locations could they go to? What sort of travel routes and travel times would be associated with those, and what sort of hazards along the way? Is the most of the route surrounded by forest, or is it through grassland, or is it short, is it long? All those considerations. And then from the on-precinct refuge sort of thing, very much a last resort kind of concept, but what is potentially possible for the precincts? Now, for a lot of them, there wasn't much, if anything. And for that, we were really considering the Neighbourhood Safer Places Guide from New South Wales RFS, and also some guidance from the WA Tourism Position Statement. But it's really about that concept of a 10 kilowatt exposure for a building and a 2 kilowatt exposure for an open space, to think about what possibilities are there for that kind of provision of emergency options. And then in wrapping that all up, that gave us an ability to effectively score everything and risk rank things, which was really one of the objectives, to be able to understand and communicate to the various stakeholders what do the precincts look like, which ones are great, which ones are good, which ones are terrible, are they all terrible? We know that funding's limited, so a degree of prioritisation is needed in that. And then again with the community consultation side of it. So the the landscape, location and building risks were scored up and tallied, and then the evacuation and refuge weightings were allocated to those to give us a final score and ultimately led through to a ranking. So back over to Melanie to give us an overview of some of the outcomes.
Thanks, Nathan. So just to wrap it up quickly, because we're running out of time, as I said before, this whole project gave us some opportunities. A lot of it was about further funding and how to direct that funding. We have a mitigation activities fund over there that local governments can apply to as long as they have a bushfire management plan. And that's for on-ground works on local government managed land. Community empowerment to me was a big one. People getting a good picture of their risk and looking at the agencies, coordinating with each other, extending this program out through other communities. So now we do town site bell contour mapping for other communities, and it's mainly gauging the effectiveness of their mitigation programs. So we've seen this year the City of Albany got $130,000 from the Disaster Ready Fund to identify safer places within the Torndirrup Peninsula. So that was that Good Beach area, and that's come out of this project. So the community put a lot of pressure on the City of Albany based on this report, and now we're going back in and looking at identifying some places where people can go as a last resort. Like leaving early is still our primary option, but if you can't, where do you go? Another $3.5 million has been awarded in Western Australia from the Disaster Ready Fund to upgrade our evacuation centres. And the Mitigation Activity Fund, $2.5 million has been spent in the 3 precincts over the past 3 years post this program, and it's all been based on the findings out of that program. So it's been slow. This was 2020 we did this project, so this has been an uptake. Government wheels grind slowly, but yeah, it's quite heartening to see things worked in a strategic manner. So thank you. That's it. Any questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering how you display, I think you call it the contour map to the public, so they're aware of the risk, and how long is the lifespan of that map when you plan to review those?
Yeah, so ideally we review them every year. So we look at what mitigation activities have happened on the ground, and we'll go out and look at the vegetation management strategies. Have they been completed? The local government feed in to us like some spatial mapping. We'll feed that into the models, but we also ground truth that. So we had community meetings, engagement sessions, where in each area we'd put the maps up and talk people through what they meant, and the local governments have also loaded them up onto their websites. So they're publicly available. I see questions now.
Yeah, just a quick one. Great presentation. Who's driving this? Is it state government, local council? Who's pushing this process through, which is it's a really good outcome?
We are finding that the community is pushing it through. So the precincts that we did the work in, they've really been actively lobbying local government and state government for the outcomes from this to be pursued. Local governments are also starting to take it up with getting the town site bell contour mapping done. It's a bit slow. It's hard as a consultant to push work where you're getting someone to pay you to do something and showing them the value of it, a lot of the times. And local governments don't have a lot of funding, so we have been lobbying the state government as well about places of last resort and interpreting risk. So, and on a personal level, I'm a volunteer firefighter. I bang on about this in every community meeting I get a chance to. So, trying to cover all the bases.